Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review covers the Candies Hughes Barracuda Funny Car. It's a 125 scale kit from Polar Lights, number POL853. Now this kit was issued in about 120 pieces, and I would say it's a skill level 4 or 5, mostly because of the frameworks and the decals, which are sometimes tricky to install. Now this vintage kit is still available at online retailers and auction sites at pretty reasonable prices. And it was a Reebox version, which was first issued in the 90s. This is the 2013 release, and it's based on the AMT 65 Barracuda funny cars that had been previously released in different box arts, etc. Now the pieces are molded in white, chrome, clear, black vinyl tires and water slide decals. And the instructions, they could stand to be a little better, but they'll work for you if you pay attention. Now when you're done, the kit will be about 8 1/4 long and about 3 1/4 inches wide by 2 1/4 inches high. Now if it's up on the prop stand with the body, it's about 4 1/2 inches high. For the most part, we'll be using tube glue or liquid cement for this kit, and sometimes some white glue for the clear parts. Here are the contents of the kit. As you can see, there are a number of trees, and the decals are separate. Now this is my version of the open box review, but it'll only take you a few seconds to see all the parts. And then we'll show you something useful, like how to put those parts together. And now when you're going through the review, make sure that you pay attention to any of the suggested health and safety items required by the manufacturers of any of the products you see here. Here are the decals for the kit, and they look great. The register is good, the colors are good, but they're a little thin, especially the stripes, the thin stripes, and I strongly suggest lots of warm water. Keep your water warm when you transfer them to your car, and then use some setting solutions to help them move around and settle into the contours when you get them on the body. Construction starts with the engine, so assemble the block and the cylinder heads, and then the engine assembly gets painted gloss red. Now the starter is gloss black, and attached to the left half of the block, the oil pan gets painted aluminum and attached to the bottom of the engine. Here are the mounting plates for the engine, the front and the rear, and we'll paint those aluminum before they're attached to the engine assembly. Now, just as a word of caution, you'll need to remember to scrape any paint or glue or chrome plating from the parts before you attach them together, or they won't bond correctly. Now, make sure that you align the engine front mounting plate like this and watch the instructions to be sure that you can install the front cover properly later. Use these pieces for the transmission and install the halves together with a thin liquid cement there, and then add the transmission fluid pan to the bottom, and then paint that aluminum. Get the rocker, the valve covers out of the kit. They're chrome plated along with the breathers, and then once again scrape off the plating and then attach those rocker cover breathers to each side, and then install the valve covers on top of the cylinder heads. Now in this step you get an option to choose either of two fuel injection systems, either a Hilborn or an Enderley. Now I chose the Enderley fuel injector system for this build. So the engine intake manifold, it is painted aluminum, then attached to the engine, and the supercharger gets attached to that. Then the drive pulley is placed in front of the supercharger, and the supercharger front and the back covers are then installed onto the supercharger block. Now the Enderley style fuel injector gets installed onto the top of the supercharger, and if you want to use the Hilborn system, then the bottom is attached to the supercharger, and then the fuel injector top is attached to the injector bottom. Now remember again, scrape the plating off or it won't stick. Then the supercharger drive belt is put to the side until later on in the engine assembly. So locate the front cover and it gets attached to the engine front mounting plate, and the supercharger front pulley is attached to a post on the engine's front cover. Then the idler pulley and fuel injection pump are attached to the front cover on the engine. Once the glue is dry on both the idler pulley and the supercharger front pulley, then you can install the supercharger drive belt onto the pulley system. And once again, watch out for that chrome. I made one part substitution here for the engine because I wanted to put wires on it. Instead of using the magneto that comes with the kit, I decided to go with a distributor, and so I used one of these pre-wired units just to give it a little bit more authenticity. And of course then you have to start this one with a battery, so it's a portable unit, as they used to say. Now there's several diagrams to wire the plugs on the internet, but there are different ways to do it. So attach the distributor cap to the base with some super glue, and then the pre-wired distributor is attached to the engine front cover with super glue where the holes are drilled, and then into the rocker cover you'll super glue those wires for the plugs, and then each spark plug wire then is glued into position with the covers right before the plug holes. Now try and get the wires to run beside one another and not be too long, so that they look pretty natural. But this is a race car, and they pretty much put new wires on all the time, so I think they leave them a little loose. Now gather up the pieces for the chassis assembly, and we're going to put that together using the front cross member and the fourth cross member, the third, and then the chassis rear cross member and the main chassis right rail. And we're going to assemble those on, then add the left side. Now this is where it gets a little confusing. The paint suggestions that are listed in the instructions end at O, but this one is marked as paint code P. So when I looked on the internet, it looked pretty much gloss black, so that's what I'm going to paint it. But before we do that, it's important that the chassis assembly dries correctly with the chassis fourth cross member shaped like it is. That helps to use something to raise the chassis up in the front end and give it a good straight appearance and construction. So I just used a couple of CD cases to make the difference and let it dry properly. Once trued and dried, I painted it, like I said, a gloss black. And then the radius rods are used, the left and the right and the front axle. Get those pieces out, and we'll add that with the tie rod, the torsion bar to the front of the chassis assembly. And to get a better bond, scrape that chrome plating, and I would use some super glue here for strength. Using these parts, we're going to paint the fuel tank support cross member there gloss black. And once that's dried, we'll install that into the chassis, and we're going to get out the fuel tank pieces there and attach the cap and the front of the fuel tank end plate there, and then we're going to assemble those tanks and then attach them to the cross member support and the front cross member there. Paint the oil filters a gloss orange, and then attach those to the remote oil filter unit, and then that is attached to the left side of the chassis assembly. Locate these pieces, and then the rear end housing front gets attached to the back, and then the assembly is painted Arctic blue metallic to match the car. Now the drive shaft gets painted gloss black and attached to the rear end housings front, and the ladder and wheels bar is left on the left side, is slid into the left side of the rear end housing assembly, and then the ladder and wheels bar is slid onto the right side for the right end housing assembly. Now the engine assembly will be installed into the chassis assembly. Just look for the mounting points. Make sure before you do this that you test fit, and then go ahead and glue the engine into position. Make sure that it looks nice and straight and meets all the contact points. Now install the rear end assembly into the chassis and line up the drive shaft between the transmission and the rear end housing. So now we'll get the headers going here, and the left and right headers are painted with a dark gray and then treated to some burnt iron coloring. And now the left header brace and the right one are then painted semi-gloss black, and the exhaust header on the left side is attached to the left side of the engine, and then the left header brace gets attached to the exhaust header and the chassis assembly there. Now, not seen here, you'll also do the same thing to the right side header assembly. Now we can work on the seating area, and the rear panel and the accelerator transmission selector lever then are attached to the floor assembly. And the fire extinguisher gets painted gloss red and detailed with some silver before it gets attached on the right side. Now the seat's painted flat black, and it gets detailed with some aluminum. And the safety harness is painted flat black, also detailed with some silver, and then it gets attached to the seat, and the seat assembly is then attached, installed into the floor assembly. Let's tackle the roll cage and the pedal assembly there. And the right and left upper roll cage bar are attached to the front bar, and then the rear roll cage bar is attached to the left and right upper roll cage bar. Now, for the roll cage assembly to dry correctly, it was placed onto the floor assembly to dry so that it all is squared up and attached at all the points. Then the diagonal roll cage bar gets glued to the front roll cage bar. However, it's not glued to the floor assembly. So once the roll cage assembly is dry, it gets removed from the floor assembly, and you can paint it Testors or any brand semi-gloss black. Then the brake pedal and the master cylinder is attached to the front roll cage bar, and then it gets installed into the floor assembly. Now we're going to use these parts, but here again you get an option, either a tack or a gauge cluster. So we're going to use the steering shaft in the box and attach that to the front roll cage bar, and then choose either the gauge cluster or the tack. I use the gauge cluster, and I slid that onto the steering shaft and box. And then the steering wheel gets detailed with some gloss black, and then it's attached to the steering shaft and box as well. Moving on to the tires and wheels, there's three options for the front wheels. The front wheel gets installed into the front tire, and then the inner wheel rim gets installed into the front tire, and that gets glued to the front wheel. Now you repeat this for the other front tire assembly, and the front wheel dust caps can be installed once the tire assemblies are put into place, and then onto the chassis assembly so that you make sure they don't get misplaced. On the rear wheel assemblies, you again get two options for the rear wheels. So use the rear tire sidewall insert that's installed into the rear tire, and then the rear wheel gets installed into the rear tire. Now the inner wheel gets painted aluminum and installed onto the into the rear tire sidewall, and the insert then is glued into the rear wheel. Now the brake rotor gets painted steel color and attached to the back of the rear wheel. Now these steps are done for the other tire assembly as well. And the left brake caliper assembly and the right ones are painted gunmetal. And it's a good idea, really, to leave the brake calipers on the parts trees until you're ready to assemble them so that you don't get them mixed up, and make sure they get onto the right side. In my sample of the kit, the rear tire sidewall had some distortion, and it was hard to tell if this was just mine or other kits. I didn't have others to check it against, but it looks like it was kind of stretched out of shape when ejected from the machine. So look for that, and if you can't live with it, well, you can always replace these rear slicks with some aftermarket items. Now we're going to add the front tire assemblies and the wheel dust caps to the front axle, and that will lock the tires into place there. And the front and left brake caliper assemblies are attached to the rear housing assembly, and the rear tire assemblies then are attached to the chassis. And that gives us what we'd call a rolling chassis. A few more details and we can add the rest of the car to this. Finally, these linkage assembly pieces and the floor assembly gets attached to the chassis, and the steering link is attached to the steering shaft and box, and then the steering linkage attached to the front axle and the steering link. And now we can work on some body prep, and note that there's a pronounced mold line on the rear quarter panels that starts at the top of the door window and runs to the rear bumper. There will also be one on the front quarter panel at the top of the fender, and just make sure that you use some intermediate sandpaper or sand sticks to remove those and get a nice smooth finish. So you don't want to remove any of the detail from those creases or anything else on the body. But go ahead, make sure there's no flash or seams or anything, parting lines that need to be removed. And then we're going to give the body a nice light spray of primer white. And then once that's dry, I painted mine using what's called Model Masters Arctic Blue, which I thought was very close to the Candies Hughes car. And the decals then are applied to the body. Once again, we're going to use lots of warm water and some setting solutions because I noticed myself that one of the decals ripped easily on the rear long door panels, so it had to be pieced back together carefully. But once they're dry, the body gets spray painted with some clear coat, to seal those in. Then the grill inserts were painted aluminum and detailed with some semi-gloss black and installed into the body. Inside the body you'll find some ejector pins like here on the roof, and there'll be some material around those because they're leaking a little bit. So just scrape those off with a hobby knife, and then if necessary you could fill those voids in, sand them off smooth, and remove the ejector pin leftovers there. We're going to sand them off smooth and then paint that aluminum later. And as you can see here, there's the molds are showing their age. There's a little flash on some of the interior parts that can be easily cleaned up with a nice sharp hobby knife. So go ahead and do that and get these parts ready. These parts, the top of the interior, the firewall, the right side interior body and the left, and the rear bulkhead get painted aluminum, and then the top of the interior is installed into the body, and the firewall gets installed into the body and attached to the top of the interior there. The right side of the interior body and then is in the right side attached to the firewall and the top of the interior. And then the left side in the same manner to the left side. And the rear bulkhead gets installed into the body and attached to the top of the interior section. And it's a good idea to lay the body assembly on its roof on something soft, and then install the chassis assembly so that all the parts dry in the correct position, and make sure there's good symmetry and evenness all the way around inside. Paint the parachute pack holder aluminum, and it gets attached to the rear of the body, and then the pack is painted flat black and detailed with some chrome silver before it gets attached to the holder. Now we can work on the windows. Carefully detach those from the tree and trim off any excess flash, and then we're going to add the windows with some clear part cement or some white glue. And there's driver and passenger side windows for the kit, but I didn't use those for my race car so that you could see into the interior. And now we can simply drop the body assembly onto the chassis, and if you had left off any decals or sponsor decals, of course you would place them into position now. Now we can go ahead and grab the body brace. You can see it's got some U-hooks at the end there on the left side, and it gets painted Arctic blue metallic like the body. And then the body brace gets placed on the chassis assembly, and it's just placed there without glue so that it holds the body up for demonstration and for working on the engine. Well, there you have it. This gorgeous red, white, and blue kit, it's been around for a while, but it's always stunning just as it was back in the day when the real car was racing. Now, I didn't have much trouble with this kit. Aside from the one tire deformation and some flash, it went together very well. It's just a little bit finicky when it comes to fitting frames together and those beautiful decals, they go on with a little bit of finesse. So I'd call this a kit for an advanced builder. Now, I did have some trouble with my spray gun, but that's because it was too cold. I initially had to strip the paint off and respray it once it warmed up a little bit. So make sure that you've got about 70 degrees when you're using an air spray gun, because you'll need that for a good finish. But if you want a kit that looks great on your shelf, I'd buy one and put it on mine. Well, we hope you liked this step-by-step scale model kit review. And so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. But you can find us on Facebook and at our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.